Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this lecture demonstration on early dance. I think it is important that I clarify what I mean by early dance. For the purpose of this talk, I am restricting it to dances that have been described in contemporary sources, for example, 18th century letters and books. This definition really limits our study to dances performed by the upper stratas of society, for they were the people who could read and write and who could engage dancing masters. What we now call folk dance or ethnic dance, of course, is an important part of the history of dance. However, this form is primarily a living tradition and as such has no part in this evening's lecture demonstration. I shall only make brief references to what we know as Scottish country dances. Most of you have knowledge of these and are aware that research is being done into this form. This is not the time nor the place to discuss methods of research and the changing of the written word into the living dance. Interpretation, reconstruction, problems of style and analysis of steps are not relevant tonight. We shall not consider the many possible ways of presenting early dance to people living in the 20th century. What we hope to do is to give you pleasure, to enrich your knowledge, and to help you see your own forms of dance in an historical perspective. The dancers with me this evening belong to a group who specialize in the presentation of dances from different historical periods. We enjoy working together, and we hope you will share our enjoyment. The courts of Europe were cosmopolitan. Princes and princesses traveled to far countries to be educated or to marry. They took with them the fashions and arts of their own country, as well as their personal servants, including musicians. Thus the court life in Scotland was in many ways similar to that in France. In the 16th century, when Mary, Queen of Scots, went to France to be educated, she took with her Scottish ladies in waiting. Scottish musicians played during her wedding festivities, and Scottish dancers became known in France. Mary was a fine dancer. One contemporary source writes, "She danced most excellently on account of her wonderful agility, but yet gracefully and becomingly, for by the quiet and gentle motion of her limbs she could express any harmony of the strings." There is little written information about dancers before the 15th century, mostly general descriptions and lists of dancers, for example, references to carols, rings, and round dances. Descriptions of movements include gambolling and frolicking. One important form of dance was the carol. In this, the dancers joined hands and accompanied themselves with singing. Sometimes they moved in a line travelling from place to place. This was the farandole. A later version was the coronto. Sometimes they formed a circle or part of a circle and danced clockwise and counterclockwise. This produced a group swaying motion and became known as branle, from a French word meaning to sway. Later, instruments were used to accompany such dances. The dancers will show you a chain dance that incorporates some of the elements of the farandole and the coronto. This will be followed by a group of branle, reconstructed from a 16th century French book, Orchesography, by Arbo. In the Complaint of Scotland, written about 1546, we are given a long list of dancers. References are made to Branle, pavans and Tordians. The pavan was one of the great dances of the 16th century. In its simplest form, it was a solemn procession performed by the nobility in magnificent clothes. Arbo writes, "A cavalier may dance the pavan wearing his cloak and sword, and others, such as you, dancing in your long gowns, walking with decorum and measured gravity. And the damsels, with demure mien, their eyes lowered, safe to cast an occasional glance of virginal modesty at the onlookers. On solemn feast days, the pavan is employed by kings, princes, and the great noblemen to display themselves in their fine mantles and ceremonial robes. They are accompanied by queens, princesses, and great ladies, the long trains of their dresses loosened and sweeping behind them, sometimes borne by damsels. Sometimes the dance was used in masquerades, and perhaps included a simple floor pattern. The dancers will now show you a figured pavan. Often a slow dance was followed by a quick one. Such was the Tordian. This was lively and nimble, with jumping steps performed close to the ground. It had an easily recognizable rhythm, and each movement phrase ended with a cadence. The steps were described in Arbo's book, and we have added a floor pattern. poorer country people have always had their own forms of dance. In 16th century England, some of these country dances became fashionable at the court of Elizabeth I, where their comparative simplicity and naturalness counterbalanced the more formal dances. Soon dancing masters began to devise dances in this country style. In 1651, John Playford published a collection of these, and their popularity spread throughout Europe. Here is one of them, a dance for two couples, Heartsease. A dance known as the Earl of Essex measure was popular for about 100 years. We have a number of manuscripts describing it in detail. Music was provided in one of these manuscripts. I'm still not sure about the mood and pace of this piece, but I do like this slow, quiet version. A new style of dance made its appearance in the 17th and 18th centuries. This reached its highest point in France during the reign of Louis XIV. At his court, life was sophisticated and full of ceremony. There were stylized ways of moving, behaving, and dancing. Louis was a fine dancer and expected his courtiers to be the same. The nobility, young and old, had regular dancing lessons in which they also learned how to stand, walk, and acknowledge each other with grace and dignity. Here are 3 studies I have devised in the style of the period. The first is a practice in stylized behavior, the second is concerned with dance gesture, and the third is a training for springing steps used in the gigue. elegant, restrained minuet was for 100 years known as the Queen of Dance. Its apparent simplicity concealed self-discipline and sensitivity. Francis Peacock, an Aberdeen dancing master, discusses the importance of teaching the minuet. It is essentially necessary for them to learn on account of its utility as a foundation for the superstructure of those graces which distinguish people of fashion and good breeding. The minuet had to conform to certain rules. Fortunately, it was possible within these rules to devise a simple short version of the dance. The minuet gradually lost its popularity, but the country dance continued to give pleasure at assemblies, balls, and in the home. It was still comparatively simple and informal, and it could be danced by young and old, the able and less able. The country dancers provided an opportunity to meet friends and to make new acquaintances. Conversation was part of the dance, as Jane Austen so aptly described in Pride and Prejudice. Do you remember the conversation between Elizabeth and Darcy? It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you should make some remark on the size of the room or the number of couples dancing. The English country dance influenced the Scottish dance, and dancing in England absorbed ideas from Scotland. Often the choice of step was left to the individual dancer. In the following country dance, we have decided to use a hopping and running sequence. Scotch Measure was a dance realised by Pat Shuldham Shaw from a collection of dances by Thomas Bray, 1699. The waltz grew out of the turning dances of northern Germany and upper Austria. To waltz means to roll or to turn. Many of these rotating dances were performed to a steady triple rhythm, that is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. In the latter part of the 18th century, these dances became fashionable in the courts and towns of Germany. The characteristic rhythm spread all over Europe, and we began to hear of waltz country dances. Here is one devised by an early 19th century dancing master, Thomas Wilson. He does not give any details about the steps or arm movements, so I have chosen a few based on material from other sources. Since the 18th century, the Scots have been famous for their reels, not only because of their unique form, but also because of the brilliant way in which they were danced. Foreigners wrote of the agility and vivacity of the dancers. They wrote of quickness and precision and lightness, and added that the women as well as the men were fine dancers. Versions of these reels became popular in other countries, and dancing masters travelled to Scotland to learn the steps. As far as I know, the first serious attempt to write down the steps was in 1805 by the Aberdeen dancing master Francis Peacock. He recorded steps used by Highland students at university. We have attempted to reconstruct some of these and incorporate them in a reel of 3. Foreign dancing masters began to devise reels of their own. These rarely included the elaborate, spectacular setting steps, although some of the floor patterns were quite interesting. Here, to end this evening, is a new reel of 4 devised by Thomas Wilson. This will be followed by a reel of 3. Thank you, dancers. No one can dance reels like the Scots. One of my favourite quotations was written by Barclay Dunn in 1818. There are no dancers in the world more expressive of inward hilarity and happiness than the Scotch when performing their own reels.